Okay, it looks like we're getting steady here. Great. It's so good to see so many familiar names, and I wish there were faces attached to them, but I'll just have to imagine you from here. Why don't we go ahead and get started for today, and feel free to continue to introduce yourselves to one another, and we'll get started with today's presentation and our national app call. Let me just find my slides here. Hold on a second. Okay. All right, welcome everyone. Just a couple of brief orientations here to the agenda for today. We're going to do some brief intros, cover some housekeeping for those of you who have not joined us in the past, so you know kind of how we work things here. Today's special topic I will be presenting on to focus on building engagement and understanding through comprehensive assessment within ACT specifically. Then we'll reserve about 20 to 30 minutes at the very end to hear from you. We really love to open the mic and have you pose your questions and learn from each other. And then just an orientation to the fact that our next call then is on Monday, February 5th. Our topic is going to focus on assertive engagement, which you all know is in the TMACT and also in the DAX, fidelity tools. And we've got some presenters locked in, but we're just figuring out kind of collaborative approaches to presenting that material and really making sure that it's also very practical and applicable to all of you. So stay tuned for that, but we think it's a good second topic related to comprehensive assessment. The other thing to just kind of keep your eyes out for is that our ACT psychiatric care provider calls will be beginning in 2024. We will have a series of calls that will look a little bit like these calls, where there will be a mix of some didactic and some consultation questions or case presentations. We're kind of working out the details on that as we speak. But we had two last year that I think were pretty successful, and we got interest among many psychiatric care providers to keep that going. So stay tuned for that. We'll hopefully circulate that out widely and get the word out there. All right, so quick housekeeping. As you all have probably noticed already, you're all muted and are not on video because of our large audience. The chat box and the Q&A box will be available for your use, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of how to use both of those in a second. We will, as you know, record this presentation, and then the recording will be available on our website after today, along with the slides. And I did put in the chat a link to today's materials. So the recording obviously isn't on there yet, but the recording will be added later. But you can get access to the slides there. I also sent it out in the National ACT listserv for those of you who participate in that. So hopefully between those two, you can get access to those. So quick note about using the chat today. It looks like that at the bottom of your screen. If you're experiencing any technical issues, you can send us a note in the chat. You can actually send them just directly to Lorna and me. There may be some times when we ask you just to share a response, or you may have a comment to share with the group, and I think that's a great place to put that kind of stuff, assuming that you're not looking for an answer to what you type in, because if you've ever been on these calls before, questions and answers really stack up pretty quickly. And so instead, for any questions and answers, we want to make sure that you're using that Q&A box that's also at the bottom of your screen. And that way we can track our questions. If you put a question into the chat box, it's hard for us to necessarily move them over. And we just want to make sure that we're either directly responding to them by typing in a response or addressing them kind of live in today's call today. Also, during the open mic time, you can not only put in a question in the Q&A box, but you can also raise your hand, and that will tell us that we can unmute you, and you'd have to unmute yourself on the other side. But the idea here is that we're able to talk to one another and have it be a little bit more kind of back and forth versus just the two of us talking heads here talking to you all. So stay tuned for that at the last portion of today, but you can always put in a question in the Q&A box at any point during today. It's really more the raising the hand and answering questions then that we reserve toward the end. All right, quick introductions. I know many of you know us quite well by this point since we've been doing these calls for the past several years, but we always get new people on board. So just quickly, my name's Maria Monroe-DeVita, and I am at the University of Washington. I co-direct the Spirit Lab and direct the Washington State Center of Excellence in Early Psychosis, and I'm also on faculty with our Northwest MHTTC, which provides free training and support to providers in the Northwest region of the country. And we run these national ACT calls along with my collaborator and partner in crime, Lorna, and I'll let her introduce herself. She can tell you a little bit more.
Hi, everyone. I'm with UNC and I'm the director of the Institute for Best Practices here and do a lot of similar things, but on the East Coast or Southeast Coast. And as Maria mentioned, it's always a joy being here because it's so cool to see so many names across the country that are very familiar to us. And some of you may be familiar with us more this past couple of years because we've been wrapping up the National ACT study. And so we've appreciated many of your participation and are starting to get the results out. And if you're part of the ACT listserv, you're starting to see some of those results come out too by the way of those email posts that we've been sharing. So glad to be here, and I get to sit back because this is Maria's show today. I'm just the supporting cast.
Great, thanks, Lorna. And I actually just moved things over to, it looks like some folks wanted to get the calls. The links to the slides. So I'm putting it out here again, and I'm going to go back to sharing the slides here in a second. Can you see that okay? Still looking okay? Lorna, you can nod your head. Is it good? Can you see everything okay?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, hopefully let us know if you didn't get that in the chat, but I put the link again to the slides and the comprehensive assessment guide, interview guide, as well as an example. And I'll go over all of those today on our call. So today we're going to talk about using the ACT comprehensive assessment as a way to build engagement and understanding of the people we serve. And I have 4 different objectives for today that I'd like to try to instill in everyone today, if possible. The first is to understand the case for assessment as a foundational tool for engagement. So to kind of use the assessment to build a more positive relationship with the people we serve, but to also not only kind of better understand them, but for them to also feel heard. And by doing so, we learn a lot more and have the potential to work together a lot better. The second objective is to learn more about the structure and process of ACT comprehensive assessment. I'm going to be taking you through a version that we use in Washington State, but that doesn't mean that you can't use other tools, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But really more the how. How do we kind of bring all of this together? I would like to, for you to all leave here and apply what you learn in that assessment toward a more integrated team-based understanding of the people you serve. Often we come away with our own individual understandings of the people we serve, but not necessarily sort of a more comprehensive, integrative approach to understanding the people that we're serving. And that's really where some 2 interrelated tools come into play that we'll be talking about today. One is called the integrated summary, and the other is the putting it together, or the PIT. And then my last objective is that in the future, my hope is by using comprehensive assessment, you will be able to better align treatment because you have that more comprehensive and holistic understanding of the people that you're serving. So that's the goal for today. I want to start today just with kind of getting everybody on the same page related to some of the challenges or the problem, or really the problems that I think we all face in kind of coming into something like comprehensive assessment. For one, it's to acknowledge that many people that are served by ACT have been failed by the system in a myriad of ways. And that's often after years of pain and suffering before they get to us, before they actually get to the point of ACT. And then add into that, the role of social determinants of health, or ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And it's a very challenging time for a lot of folks. And that often negatively impacts the relationship with the team, that necessary rapport, the needed trust that, needs to be in place to be able to really work well with the person. And I think for a lot of people, they have good reason not to engage with us by the time they get to us, because there has just been so much that people have been through by the time they get to an ACT team and they meet the criteria for an ACT team because the bar is so high. Unfortunately, like, it's too bad that people have to fail in the system and jump through so many hoops by the time they, meet those criteria to get into a program like this. So that's really on the client side, or the people that we serve, that side of the equation. The other thing is, on the one hand, team-based care, I think there's a lot of strength and help embedded within kind of doing something as a team. But I also think it can be challenging to, really get a more comprehensive, integrated understanding of the people we're serving. Often things get kind of, factioned off, or assessments, for example, are in different places. If you're the employment specialist, you're looking in the chart for, wait, what happened in the last psychiatry appointment, or, within nursing, maybe some of that information doesn't necessarily get to the peer. There's all this kind of, complication in the work that we do in team-based care. And so my hope is to kind of present you with some tools and conceptualizations of doing this work that helps us to just do that team-based care better. And again, with that goal of better understanding the person we serve. And so, again, one solution, and there's multiple solutions to the problems I shared, but one is to kind of build that bridge between assessment and engagement. And so, I'm preaching to the choir here. I know it comes as no surprise to you all that it's all about the relationship and the work you do every day. But as two of our colleagues, Michelle Salyers and Sam Severis, have noted in the literature, it can take years in some cases just to get to the point that the person feels known, understood, and accepted. And that's what we're talking about here, is to really get to that point of really being known, understood, and accepted. So within ACT, I know everyone on this call probably has somewhat different ways in which you do this work, but what I am kind of presenting here is what I hope is kind of consistent with what we all do, or that we can kind of get to a place of us all doing it similarly and having at least a similar flow of clinical and communication processes, starting with that screening at the very beginning, assessing where the person is, and I'll talk a little bit more about those three different elements here in a second, how that then contributes to and provides that foundation for strong person-centered treatment planning. You're on a regular basis, and this says weekly team meeting, it should say daily team meeting. Every day, you're kind of constantly getting a better sense of kind of where the people are that you're serving, and what the team is doing to be able to help them, and troubleshooting and brainstorming ways to address immediate needs. And that's through the service delivery. Day to day. And that engagement is just this ongoing process, right? That people, may quote unquote be an engagement stage, but for many of the people we serve in ACT, they're often always in that engagement stage. Just by definition, I think, of kind of the complexity of many of the folks that we're serving, to just continue to kind of build that engagement. So today we're really going to focus on these three that are highlighted here: the comprehensive assessment, integrated summary, and the PIT. And what I'd like to do is kind of share a little bit about how those three different pieces fit together based on understanding kind of the what, why, and how related to assessment. So the what is really the data or the facts about the person that they come into the program with. It's often like the reason for referral, or the quote unquote presenting problems. It may be that they experience auditory hallucinations, or persecutory delusions, or maybe aggressive behavior, or suicidal ideation, quote unquote, like a lack of insight, or they're having challenges with taking their meds. But those are just the data points. Those are barely scratch the surface of who this person is, or why those are the issues they are, or the presenting facts about them. So in order to get kind of underneath that, we really need to understand the essence of the person underneath all of that. What contributes to the presentation of those challenges, how those challenges get in the way of their goals, what they want in their lives, what makes them a problem for the person, those kinds of things. So really better understanding sort of the why underneath the what. And then there's the how. What can be done about it? how can the team help? This gets at the kind of crux of the services that we deliver within the ACT team. How can others in their life help? Maybe they've got other natural supports or a neighbor or a friend who can also help with addressing and kind of getting back to sort of addressing the what, because we understand more the why. And how can they help themselves, really leveraging some of those strengths and resources and skills of each person that we serve. And so if we think about all three elements, they all three kind of help to facilitate engagement and understanding of the person. I think it also helps us to then have a stronger foundation in the work we do. So in other words, getting from the what to the why informs the how. And so I'd like to just kind of go through an illustration, maybe a common example that kind of I think probably resonates for a lot of ACT teams and the work that we do with the people we serve. So one common what or presenting issue is not taking medications. And so in order to understand the what, why is that person not taking their medications? Again, we need to get into the why. So maybe they're not taking their medications because they're not working. Lo and behold, that's a pretty simple why. Maybe they have side effects that are really challenging for them. They're falling asleep in the middle of the day, or they have terrible dry mouth, or they, have akathisia, and it's really challenging for them to sit still. And so in order to address what's happening for the person, we need to then be able to get to the how. And so maybe we lower the dosage of the medication. Maybe we change the medication. We assess whether there is a need to change and then make some of those changes based on that. Maybe we add a side effect medication, maybe a cogentin or another anticholinergic medication to help address some of those symptoms. Another why could be that they're feeling paranoid. Maybe it's that the formulary has changed. The white pill is now a different shape, or it's a different color. And, could that mean that somebody's doing something to harm me in some way? And that's what's going on here with these medications. And so maybe we then need to add some psychoeducation. Or maybe we can challenge those beliefs through cognitive restructuring and other cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis skills to address it in that way. Another one is disorganization. And so maybe you do bubble packs or medisets to help with the person to be able to take their medications, or you do something like behavioral tailoring where you put the medication within the person's routine. Maybe it's by the coffee pot or something. So they know, okay, every time I go for that coffee in the morning, I need to take my medications at the same time. What are some other reasons why people don't take their medications? Love to see some comments in the chat about that. Any other thoughts? Why do people not take their medications? I mean, these are just 4, just off the top of my head when I put together this slide. What else do we see? Internal preoccupation, weight gain, I feel fine, religion, yep. Keep them coming, keep them coming. Problems with access or refills, yep. Yeah, maybe they like their symptoms, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, you guys, we could fill multiple slides up here, right? For why people don't take their medications. But do you want to guess what the number one how is that ACT teams use? And I can give you a hint, it's not listed here. What's the way that we often deal with people not taking their medications? LAI, that's one. Yep. Transportation. What do we see a lot of in some of our teams? Have them take it in front of you. Yep. Eyes on meds, prompting. Yep. So that's one how, and it's probably the one we see the most commonly used. But if you can see here, all of the different whys and all of the ones that you put in the chat, you have an imbalance and a kind of a misdirected how or way that we're intervening with the person if we just don't understand that why. All we know is the what, and we don't get underneath that. And we could have a number of different examples of that. So that's kind of my soapbox, I guess, to get into then kind of how that fits into comprehensive assessment. So the way I like to think about it is this assessment itself, which is basically just the way that you kind of gather the information, is the what. Those are the data points that, again, kind of scratch the surface just barely. And again, doesn't always tell us how those data points hang together or how we conceptualize or better understand that information, that how they're all connected, like drivers or motivations or challenges or how they've changed or may continue to change over time. And it's really not until we integrate that information through an integrated summary and the PIT, which we'll again go over here today, that we get to that why. So again, then that helps us with the how. And of course, through doing our person-centered planning, treatment planning, and our daily team meeting, it allows us to kind of have a regular ongoing conversation about that. All right, so today I'm going to share a version of the comprehensive assessment that we use in Washington State, and I've shared with a number of other states. But I also want to do so acknowledging that some of you come from states where you have your own ACT assessment. You may not even use the term comprehensive, but you've got your kind of own tools that you use that are required from other sources, often your state or your agency or your region. So we get that. Others may be familiar with the good old 2003 version of the ACT Startup Manual. I actually snapped a picture of mine in my office this morning because I couldn't find it anywhere online anymore because it was published in 2003 and it's now 2023. But, there's some good nuggets in there. I will say there's some outdated things too, like their comprehensive assessment. So for example, one of their forms that they have in there for assessing substance use is something called the CD-SAM, which is really a research tool, and it's almost 30 pages long. So, talk about scaring you all in terms of having to do a lot of assessments. That is one thing that probably isn't so feasible in this day and age with the work that we do within our ACT teams. And so we try to provide some updated tools to be able to kind of more quickly get to the crux of some of these questions. Some of you may also be familiar with that. The EBP toolkit, the ACT toolkit, the particular section of that, there's multiple sections of it. The training frontline staff is the particular attachment that I'm talking about here. And you'll see on page 4 of module 3, that's really where they start to talk about comprehensive assessment. And so while this version doesn't necessarily have the questions or the forms to fill out related to comprehensive assessment, they do at least provide more specificity around how, and they provide an example of that integrated summary based on that one. And again, that one's a little long. It's like 23 pages. I'm going to share with you a 6-page one that we pulled together. And again, with the idea that, longer isn't better. We really want to get to the truth here and using all the tools that we have in front of us. And so that's why, I want to talk to you a little bit about our maybe not so fancy version compared to these others that have a lot of color and stuff, but it's the one that we use in Washington State. And my colleague Jeff Roskelly took the lead in developing several years ago, and we just continue to update. So this is our guide for the comprehensive assessment, and it's mostly focused on interview questions. But I'll talk a little bit here in a second about using different data sources and triangulating those data sources to be able to really get to kind of some of the answers that we want to get to. For each of those. So who does what? Well, the team divides and conquers. So the idea here is that across these 7 domains, you have different team members who are they've got the most experience and expertise. They've got the skill set to really be able to delve into those questions related to each of these domains. So for mental health, it's typically related to symptoms. So typically, the psychiatric care provider or one of the master's level clinicians on the team who has been trained in doing assessments would be taking that one on. There's a personal strengths domain, which any team member can take on. I personally love when the peer specialist takes that one on, to focus on the person's strengths and resources and getting a better sense of that with them. It's also a really nice one to lead with, I think. Physical health, the nurse or nurses on the team. Substance use is typically the co-occurring disorder specialist, or some of them are called substance abuse specialists or SUD specialists in your states. Any team member can take on a focus on sociocultural domain and the psychosocial domain, and then employment and education is rooted pretty squarely in the employment specialists area of expertise. There is also there are a number of different questions that assess functioning or psychiatric rehabilitation needs. So kind of what are the skills that need to be trained or cued or prompted, or that we need to be able to like reinforce in some way. And those are integrated throughout. We really saw that as something that you could speak to in multiple sections rather than having its own section. It really is conducive to even the physical health section or the substance use section. So you'll see them interspersed throughout. And then just for your information, if you've got it handy and you can open it up in front of you or pull it up on your computer, you'll see then that we delve into kind of what each of those different elements, the different questions or areas of assessment in each of those domains in the table 1, elements of comprehensive assessment in the interview guide. So sources of information come from multiple places. We've obviously got interviews that are with the person receiving services or family and natural supports. But then we also have a number of other sources of information that you've got at the ready. And this is where I want to just reinforce, and I can't state enough how important these other data sources are and can be for you. Rather than getting overwhelmed by, oh my gosh, there's all these questions within this interview template, going back to what else do we collect information on? What are we required to collect information on? We don't assume this work happens in a vacuum, but rather that, we've all got kind of our own areas that we need to attend to in each of our states and agencies. And so if there's other assessment information that you are need to collect, that you're using that. Medical records, including those that come at the time of referral or during hospitalization, for example, and just direct observation, being able to kind of work with and see the person and have some time to really be able to kind of observe on your own, with the idea that you're really triangulating that information across multiple data sources. So again, I want you to just not think of that interview guide as the end all and be all, but rather a guide. And it's really just a guide around the interview questions, not all of the other data sources that you may be able to kind of pull in and say, I don't have to ask that question because I already did. It was included in our intake, or I got that information from the hospital, or mom told me a little bit about this. But you can kind of again, make sure that you've got the best information across those data sources. So again, if you've got it in front of you, I want to just quickly orient you to the different elements. So one is that there are these tip sheets. And that is that each of them is broken up. There's an orientation to each section in terms of like customizing the order, or using open-ended questions, those kinds of things, points to keep in mind for each of those sections. Then the heart of it is really these interview templates. And these are sample questions. So if you're familiar with, for example, the ACT manual and the way that their forms are laid out, those are really meant to be question and then you answer. You fill in the answer to each of the questions. This is not meant to be that way. It's more to kind of set the stage for multiple types of questions that you could be asking, but not assuming that you're going to ask them all. Again, with the assumption that you've got data coming in from other places to be able to help you get a better sense of the person related to those questions that are in the interviews. So there are some sample questions in that block script. There are clinician notes that are in these kind of grayed out text boxes, and it's denoted with this like lightning bolt icon. I'll show you an example here in a second. We also have a rationale for questions, just so we can kind of tie to specific symptoms or reasons for why you might ask that question, and those are indicated with brackets. So for example, here we've got a clinician note. This is the psychosocial section, and we're asking a lot of questions about the person's income and health insurance and disability benefits and those kinds of things. And the note is that some people may feel cautious about providing detailed information about their finances. And so, this should be validated, and the rationale for the questions below should be explained. So just giving kind of a heads up to don't feel like you have to, if you need to kind of take a break or not push for that, it's okay not to. Like, let's just kind of hold off and come back to it. So that's on pages 47 and 48. We've also got on page 15 some examples of some of the bracketing I talked about, which gives you a rationale for why you're asking these questions. So for example, in here we have what happens that breaks or stops your concentration. This assesses cognitive and social attentiveness. In another area, are there times when you lie or sit around most of the day? Does this ever last more than one day? That's assessing for physical inertia. So just again, kind of trying to provide the clinician with sort of tools to be able to kind of be set up for success and kind of covering all the bases related to these questions. And then we have kind of a third section, which we call areas for further assessment. And this is not part of the comprehensive assessment. It is meant to be, it's to point you to other resources and have them kind of at the ready or handy if in those cases you need to do more in-depth and oftentimes sensitive assessment for particular issues. So for example, we've got here on page 16, when we're asking about psychotic symptoms, the clinician note here kind of points out that there are certain types of paranoia or command hallucinations that may increase an individual's risk for violence toward others. And so just to be sensitive to that, and so you can go into the areas for further assessment, and you can pull out the VRAG, the Violence Risk Appraisal Guide, for example. And again, some of your agencies may have your own tools that you use, and that's fine too. Again, we're just kind of trying to put everything in one place. All of these measures are on our Spirit Lab website that you can, pull from there and document it again in the guide itself, just to kind of, again, set everyone up for success with that. So in terms of just general tips about it, the way we recommend using the interview guide, and again, remember, the interviews are only one data source. You're going to have lots of other information at the ready based on data you already collect or from your referral sources too. But the idea is that you're taking each of those domains. So let's say I'm the employment specialist. I'm going to get to know my questions. So for the employment and education section, I'm going to pull that. We actually have teams that just copy and paste into their own template and integrate with, okay, what do we already collect in our agency? Do we already cover some of these questions? And if so, to have a place to be able to kind of lay that out. So it's just easy to be able to track what you have information on already and what you need to be able to ask in these interviews. So you can tailor it to however you want to ask the question. These are written in a way that, again, is trying to kind of be written sort of with motivational interviewing in mind, and being able to kind of be more strengths-based in those assessment questions. But it doesn't mean it's a semi-structured interview to the point that you have to ask every single one of those questions. And then tailor what and how you ask based on those other assessments that you already do or info you already have. And like I said a minute ago, just using your own interpersonal style. So really make it your own. These are not sequential necessarily, so they can be done in parallel. So for example, on a given day, as you bring in a new person onto your team to serve, in that given day, the nurse might have some time with the person and start their assessment, and the peer and the employment specialist may bring in the strengths assessment and the employment and education assessment kind of all in that sort of same day. So they can be done in parallel during that kind of same time frame. You can also customize based on initial impressions or the person's preferences. So let's say they come out and say, I want a job. That's the main thing I want, or I want housing. And so you may start or lead with that particular area of assessment first, or you may start with, as I said earlier, the strengths assessment, because that's kind of a nice way to be able to build that rapport and not just delve into this interrogation about my symptoms and all of the bad things that have happened to me and led to me being here. They can also be done while delivering initial services. So the way that we train the comprehensive assessment in Washington is really to almost have the assessment in your back pocket, that you get to know your questions and are able to kind of know like these general areas that you want to know more about. And then you may go back to it after seeing the person, but you're not like necessarily pulling out a tablet or, the forms in front of them and then checking off every single answer. You could, but you don't have to. I think just as flexible as you can be. And again, thinking about the goal here is this engagement. The idea here is that the kinds of questions and the way that they're asked in here are conducive to the person feeling more like they've been heard, to be able to feel like no one's ever asked me that before. This is like the first time that anybody's really asked me about more the nature of these particular symptoms that have been so debilitating for me all this time. Nobody bothered to ask about X, Y, and Z that you just, as the team, asked me about here. So think about it that way, that this is, again, as flexible as you want to make it within your own state, within your own agency. And these are just another set of tools. But the important thing is that we're doing some version of comprehensive assessment within each team. The other component is then integrating that information. And again, we call it the integrated summary. You might call it something different. In the ACT toolkit, the SAMHSA ACT toolkit, they actually call the integrated summary the comprehensive assessment. But it's basically just the way they bring together all of the information into one place. And I mentioned earlier, that's a challenge in team-based care. And our EHRs often don't help us in that regard, right? They're just like the way that they're laid out. You've got different sections for different areas, or you have to put it in a progress note. I would actually encourage you, where you can, work with your agency and EHR to even be able to kind of develop some of these tools within your own EHR. That's actually possible with a lot of EHRs. In Washington, for example, with our 22 PAC teams, we've got 17 different EHRs. And being able to kind of have each of them sort of tailored, at least to be able to kind of meet these needs, I think is really important for team-based care. So the integrated summary is it's created from the information gathered through the comprehensive assessment. And again, team members who complete each section write up a brief summary of that particular area of assessment or that section. So again, if I'm the peer, and let's say I did the personal strengths assessment, I'm going to just pull together what I learned about the person and write that up. Or the employment and education section. Again, it's not a fill in the blank of every single question that was asked, but more of an understanding of kind of what did I hear and what is the information that's important for me to share with the rest of my team members, and write that up into a paragraph or two, depending on how much information was yielded, and then pulling that into one integrated document and then discussed and edited by the team before it's finalized. Now, teams have different ways of pulling it into one document. For example, we have teams where the primary clinician is the one that kind of takes the lead, and all the team members for that particular individual treatment team will send their integrated summary paragraphs to them, and then they pull it into one document and then they review that together. A lot of teams will also use their program assistant, and I think that's a really great use of resource that is primarily administrative but also can be helpful around the clinical practice. So the integrated summary, you have an example of that in the handouts. It's the cover page looks like this. So only pages 2 through 6. So again, it's only 5 pages, actually, almost 6 pages, is the actual integrated summary. We also have the PIT, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the last two things laid out here are a sample recovery plan, which is basically your treatment plan or your person-centered treatment plan, and how the information collected in the comprehensive assessment and the integrated summary and PIT then play out with what you would specify in that treatment plan, and then how the same information is specified in the weekly client schedule. So those are kind of two other topics I think that could be, I know we've done some training or, provided some information on in previous didactics on this call, but I just wanted you to have a sense of those first two areas are really the thing we're talking about. And then it looks like this. You can see the different sections laid out. And again, I would say this is actually a little long. Our teams tend to have more like 4 pages. They will often even bullet what they write up. And I think that's fine. It doesn't have to be like pretty. I think it just needs to be right. It needs to be kind of the kind of information that's going to be helpful to you in the work that you're doing with the client. And again, with the idea that the process by which you're collecting that information is a positive one by them. So then we've got the PIT, or the putting it together. The PIT has multiple purposes. One is that it is kind of a way of synthesizing the information that you've collected as a team. You don't pull it from anywhere else. You basically pull it from what you've already collected so far. And it's one page. I'll show you an example of it in a second. But it's basically, for those of you that are do individual therapy, this idea of clinical formulation or case conceptualization, that's what this is, the PIT. But it's basically a way to have a team-based version of that, so that the whole team is kind of contributing to one sort of set of understanding of the person that you're working with and putting it in this, like literally this one pager. It's like a snapshot of you're all getting on the same page, basically. It also facilitates mutual understanding to do treatment planning. So our teams will pull that in to then be able to kind of use to drive some of the treatment planning conversation. And I'll show you in a second why that is conducive to it, but it basically has specific interventions that could be used or applied, but don't necessarily have to be. So they're under consideration, and it helps kind of make that explicit to everybody doing the treatment planning. It's also a way of keeping the assessment current. So this is one of the biggest questions we get is, how do you collect everything about a person? I mean, I talked about the complexity of many of the people we serve with an ACT by the time they get to us. How in the world are you going to have the time to collect all that information within a very short period of time? Usually it's that kind of 30-day window when they first come on board. You don't have to. And again, we don't want to interrogate people to death or to the point that they feel like disengaged from us even further. The point is, again, to get some critical information that helps you to kind of move forward as a team collaboratively with the people you're serving to better understand and integrate that understanding into the services you're delivering. This is the way, the PIT is the way you keep that assessment current. So a year later, you're going to have a lot more information. And then instead of redoing any sort of assessment or integrated summary, it goes in the PIT. And you kind of redo the PIT as a way of also then having a tool for that treatment planning a year later. Recognizing that you have, after 6 months, a treatment plan review before that 1-year window that they've been served. So this is the PIT. Again, it's just this one pager. There is a summary of shared understanding that's on the other side, which I'll show you in a minute, but that's just to kind of provide sort of a sense of like, okay, collaboratively with the client, what are we seeing as sort of what they're presenting with, what they want out of treatment, what are some directions we can go, that kind of thing. So it lays out what I like about the order of things, the order of business in the PIT. And I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because I know we're getting a little low on time, is that the top column there, or the top row, not column, row, lays out a lot that is focused on the client's own words and strengths. And so their wants and needs, which are often, they overlap with the treatment plan goals, or will help you get to those goals. by way of putting them here kind of clear to everybody, including the client, their preferences for treatment. So maybe they have certain services that they want or don't want, or frequency of time that they want to be seeing people, or location of service, those kinds of things, or not seeing anyone. That's where you put it, that their preferences are specified on paper on this tool. Strengths, and that includes resources and skills that they bring to the table, the kinds of things that I think, again, can kind of be leveraged when you think of like treatment planning and services that would be conducive to kind of leveraging those strengths. Predisposing factors. So this is where things like history of mental illness, or history of trauma, those kinds of things would go in that predisposing factors. And for those of you that are familiar with the strength vulnerability model, that's kind of something that can go. It's conducive to that sort of conceptualization. Then we have precipitating factors and perpetuating factors. So precipitating really goes back to like, when did this all start and what started it at the beginning? So, and by the way, this example here is the Robert example that I mentioned is in your handouts. I'm just kind of using them as an illustration here. So maybe, drug or alcohol use was part of that. And it may be the same perpetuating factors. What is it that keeps the problem going for the person? But it could also be, being unhoused or family stressors. Their understanding of their mental illness, this gets into kind of, again, their own words. In Robert's case, he calls it a spiritual problem. Also, social and cultural factors, and then physical health factors that come into play to, again, help us to better understand what is it that we need to be doing collaboratively as a team and with the person served to be able to meet their needs. This last row focuses on the client's needs based on the team's analysis, which may be different from the client's preferences for treatment, but it's the place to be able to kind of lay out, this is what we're thinking, and it keeps it on the table. We're not stepping away from, okay, just because they don't want to work on substance use, for example, we're not going to put it anywhere in here. It's still documented as something that maybe we, at some point, that this is a need, and whether it gets put into the treatment plan is yet to be determined, because that's the next part of the process. Then we get at stages of treatment. And again, for those of you that aren't familiar, it's adapted from Prochaska and De Clementi's trans-theoretical model of behavior change, where we look at stages of change readiness, which could be any kind of change. It doesn't have to be necessarily substance use. And guiding from one end of the model, which is more focused on kind of whether the person recognizes that they have a problem in the first place, and so pre-contemplation if they don't at all, to then contemplation and preparation, which are actually two different stages, but we're combining them here so that they align with the stages of treatment. But that's really where they start to kind of think about, maybe there is a problem. I have a little bit of an orientation to that or understanding of that, or they may even be preparing for or planning for some of that change, to then action, where they're committed to making change, and then maintenance, where they've maintained positive changes for at least 6 months. And again, we map onto that stages of treatment. So engagement, motivation, which you may know as persuasion. Some of us have been using this motivation term instead, because it feels a little bit more palatable. Active treatment, and then wellness planning, which is also known as relapse prevention. But you can see here that the stages of treatment then are conducive to certain interventions that align with the person's stage of change and then the stage of treatment. So we have that laid out here. And again, with Robert, he's in engagement for a lot of the particular areas, some motivation for substance use, but for the other different kind of domains that we're looking at here, mostly engagement, and then the specific interventions that tie on to that. So this is the shared understanding. And again, I don't want to get too into it at the moment, you can kind of take a look at it at your leisure. This is just an example, but basically just is a shared understanding of treatment planning. And by the way, just to be clear, the team pulls this together based on their integrated summary and the comprehensive assessment, but the idea is that you're putting it in front of the client to be able to kind of validate and specify and lock in basically what's on here. And that's where there may be some disagreement about it. And that's where there's a nice place to be able to put, well, here's what the team thinks, and here's maybe where the client thinks, but we're able to at least kind of come to some shared understanding of what we agree to do going forward, which would be setting the stage for the treatment planning section. And the same is true for this shared understanding before treatment planning. So just in summary, the different pieces of that comprehensive assessment, you've got each designated team member who collects and summarizes assessment information for their section or that domain. Then one team member brings all the assessment information together into that integrated summary. I mentioned earlier that often it's the primary clinician or the program assistant that will do that. Then the team will meet to kind of finalize that. And, I think synthesize, but also you may be making corrections. Maybe the peer has different information than the employment specialist or the co-occurring disorder specialist. So you're kind of reconciling any inconsistencies and getting to a better understanding of where the person's at related to those domains. Then the primary fills out the PIT based on that integrated summary info and client input. And then you utilize that PIT for person-centered planning just as a guide for it. Again, you've got the interventions specified, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to be making it into the treatment plan because that's part of the treatment planning process. And then updating that PIT annually as a way of updating the assessment. So with that, I kind of breezed through that a little fast, but I want to just kind of welcome any questions and thoughts. And I think there are already a few questions in the Q&A, so I want to make sure that we're addressing that. Okay, so Katie Kirk is asking, just wondering if using the same comprehensive assessment format for all teams in a state helps with language and understanding rather than agencies all having their own forms. Yes, I think that's true. I think that doesn't mean that agencies won't continue to use their own forms. I think that's the thing that we're trying to sort of reconcile. We don't have control over that. And in most places, they like the forms that they use, or it's tied to some other kind of requirement, whether it's policy. And so our understanding it in Washington has been to just at least have a common way of thinking about the comprehensive assessment and having a template for that, knowing that we've got different assessments that are happening in some of those agencies. And the bottom line is, again, just to be able to have a mechanism to be able to kind of get to the heart of what is happening with the person. Let's see, Nicole has a question. As a peer support specialist, there tends to be times of role confusion and a roadblock of how to engage with our clients. Can you provide more information on the roles of a peer specialist and what they can do and not do? Oh, this is a really, really good question. And I've got to say, there are some differences of opinion on this, which I don't know, Lorna, if you're on there. But that we've, had a lot of discussion about, and I think we continue to learn about is just what, some of you probably were on, for example, Pat Deegan was on one of our National Act calls talking about the role of peers related to discussing or managing medications, as I recall. And she takes a pretty hard view on what peers should and shouldn't be doing, and that they shouldn't be doing anything related to the medications or assessments or specific interventions within a team. With an ACT, I find that a little hard because you've got this whole team that could really benefit from a very specific role of the peer in doing more recovery oriented practice within the team. So maybe you're using you're doing RAP planning, or there's the program IMR, illness management and recovery, and so using some of that. So to me, doing a strengths assessment can very much be something that a peer can do. And but I recognize you may be hearing something different in your state. And so I think, reconciling it with what your state is asking you to do versus what, you know, we're suggesting in a team-based care model, I think is important to do. And I think, you know, we don't have control over what a certain state does related to a peer's role, but I think that that's a very good, you know, application. I don't know, Lorna, anything else you want to say to that? I know it's hard not to equivocate on these things.
Right. I think our views sometimes differ a little bit around this, but I think, you know, when somebody's enrolled in ACT, it's making it clear that we're operating as a team and we share information as a team so that we can provide the best care to you. And if a peer learns some information that would be helpful to include as part of this broader assessment, you know, being able to say, hey, I think this would be really important information for the team to share. You know, are you going to be okay if I'm sharing this? And if they say no, it still is something that can be addressed in supervision, you know? So I think navigating those spaces, but I think part of it is the informed consent that we operate as a team. And what does that mean?
Yeah, that's great. I think that's helpful. Let's see. Does anyone on this call who is currently practicing on an ACT team implement the comprehensive assessment successfully or completes it how Maria presented? It's a great question, Katie. I don't know if anybody's gonna to answer that. I know we've got some examples that, and we actually use them in training to kind of complement the version that we have that is the Robert case example that I shared with you guys to kind of show in real teams what that has looked like in at least our Washington teams. And I can tell you when we do fidelity assessments that we have quite a few teams who have implemented it, but we have quite a few teams who have not and have had real challenges with that, especially during COVID. So take that, you know, with a grain of salt. And I think, again, the more what I would love for you all to kind of consider in thinking about this is that this is not an all or nothing proposition. And do not let perfection, what is the phrase? Perfect be the enemy of good.
Mm-hmm.
That you can still utilize comprehensive assessment in a way that gathers more information that really needs to be learned about a person rather than saying, oh, we don't have time to do this and we're just not going to do it. And, you know, you no longer have a process then. Never mind the fact that then it's about the information gathering or the what that I talked about earlier, but it's also bringing it all together as a team, which is so important. At the very least, I think bringing your all, you know, all of you together to say, what did you learn about this person, especially when they first start on a team is really important. Let's see. Out of curiosity, when looking at clients' needs based on team analysis, is there concern that this segment can lean toward no longer being person-centered? Obviously, the overall objective of the CA is to have person-centered approaches, so I was curious. Absolutely. I think that's a really hard dialectic or paradox that we're faced with it there. And my take on that is, you know, I love this idea of you keep things on the table. I know the new version of IMR, it's called enhanced IMR. That's a big concept in there, and because the enhanced version of IMR focuses on substance use. And the idea is that substance use is often one of those things that nobody wants to tackle, particularly the people we serve. And so sometimes teams in the name of person-centeredness say, oh, okay, or, you know, or they don't want to work on certain things just in general. It doesn't have to be substance use. And so it's this, you know, almost like you put your hands up and say, I guess we won't deal with any of these things. And the fact is that by the time you come to an ACT team, you need many of these services. And so it's kind of keeping it on the table. And I think, but not in a way that it's behind closed doors, but that you're genuinely sharing that this is still something that we are kind of keeping here or holding a place for, that we'll continue to come back to. I also think about it like when we think of kind of still reapproaching around employment, for example, in the supported employment model, a person may not want to work right out of the gate, but you're kind of still keeping the potential kind of on the table to continue to reapproach or think of how to tailor that for the individual. So that's my long-winded answer there. Lorna, are there others you want to make sure we cover here? Thank you,
Um,
Amanda from Washington. I will share with Katie that Amanda is one of our team leads and actually was a former team lead and is now an agency lead that she in Washington. She said they find it helpful, though hard to keep up on without it being inputted into the EHR, which I think is exactly what we hear from sites. So I know, for example, our Spokane teams have it in their EHR, which I think helps a lot in being able to have it more accessible to the team. Oh, and thank you, Logan, for also sharing your experience there too. And remember, you may have your own version. I think the important thing is that we're setting everybody up for success to be able to engage and understand what's happening with the people you're serving. Let's see. There's a comment about the pit and let's see, wish I would have seen it when I was in direct practice. I especially like how it uses and modifies the stages of treatment. So often you see agencies identify clients' stages of change, but not the stage of treatment. Identifying the stage of treatment is a better way to put the onus back on the team for their interventions and takes the focus off the potential negativity around the client's stage of change. Thank you, Amy. That's helpful. Another question, does the PIT have a template for employment specialists to look at to write their part of the assessment? So it's embedded within this. So if you can think of, so there's the integrated summary, the employment specialist is still going to write up a blurb about what they learned from the client and from the information presented to them about employment and education. That's going to go in an integrated summary. So the employment specialist is going to have, they pretty much for every client have a section, even if the client doesn't want to work, then they're at least gathering information about their history or, barriers to that, for example. But then in the PIT, there should be an employment. Maybe that's where this question is coming from. Is there not an employment box to check? Because if there isn't, that's just an error on my part. There should be a box to fill out that says this person, this is a potential intervention. But then you may put it in the strength section because the person has a strong history of working, or you may put it in even one of the precipitating factors. Maybe they had a really stressful job or they went to college and that's really when their symptoms started. And so that's where, again, the employment specialist would have gotten that information as part of their assessment with the person. So hopefully I clarified that. And again, if that's not one of the interventions listed, that's my bad. I can change that. Amy's asking, is there a state where all ACT teams are required to use the same assessment materials that you know of? I'm sure there are. Like I know New York has a certain set of measures that they collect. And if anybody's a New York team here, I'm happy to feel free to even just raise your hand if you want to say something or put it in the chat. But New York comes to mind because they have probably the most robust data collection by teams about their clients, their client level data on symptoms and employment and those kinds of things. And it's visible publicly. So you can actually go to the New York State Office of Mental Health website and were you going to say something?
Yeah, that's through the CARE survey process that they do
That's
every
true.
6 months. That's not
Which is a little
quite
different.
clinical
Yeah,
assessment. So
that's true. That's true. But like maybe status versus measures. So it's more about like who's working or where they're living or
yeah,
hospitalization data, those
outcome
kinds of, yeah,
status, that's what
yeah.
they're collecting.
Not
Yeah.
as much like clinical,
No, I was trying
yeah.
to think. I don't feel like we saw that much. And I think part of it is giving I think EHRs have kind of steered us in a certain direction. You see it more with treatment plans that a state may have a universal template that they expect teams to use, but I don't necessarily see it as often with the clinical assessments. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I was going to, yeah, you got
Yeah.
Molly too. I was going to respond to Molly.
Well, but I think this points to another question that I want to make sure I clarify too. So the question, it's actually in the chat, just that you all can see. So for TMAC purposes, which is the fidelity tool that Lorna and I developed, would using the comprehensive assessment, this comprehensive assessment, fulfill the nursing vocational co-occurring disorder assessment requirements? And the answer is yes. So what we've done is we've pulled in, especially around, for example, employment, pulled in like the career profile that's used in IPS, but it's 17 pages. And so we're trying to balance some of this with, especially at this stage in treatment. So some of those measures out there or assessments out there that are embedded in specific evidence-based practices, that doesn't mean later you're not going to do those. This is about getting the most accurate and comprehensive information right out of the gate in those kind of first 30 to 60 days that you're seeing a client. So you may then go later and do something more comprehensive where you're really pulling in the career profile from IPS, the individual placement and support model, for example, that the employment specialist would do. But in terms of for TMAC purposes, this assessment has been pulled from multiple. It's also been pulled from the CFI, if you're familiar with a cultural formulation interview, as part of the DSM-5, where it brings in questions that are focused on, culture and identity, that then is a separate measure. So we're trying to kind of bring it into one comprehensive measure. But again, trying to not have like a 32-page, write up about it. I mean, we recognize you guys have a lot to do besides like sitting there in front of your computer. So I think that's the idea here. We're not talking about just for the sake of getting documentation done, but really like, what are we learning about this person and what do we do with that information? Katie, I think you've raised your hand, so I want to make sure that are you on it already, Lorna? I can unmute her. Where is she? Hold on.
I don't see her. Oh, there she is. There she is. I got it. Allow to talk.
You got
All
her.
right.
Okay, cool. You're allowed. You just have to unmute yourself, Katie. Maybe you didn't mean to do this. Okay. You're so active usually. We figured you might have a comment or a question. Okay, we'll take you off.
We'll try to take you off. Let's see.
I've got her. Oh,
Remove
wait, I don't
permission
want.
to talk. All right.
There you
Got it.
go. No, that's okay. No worries, Katie. Any other comments or questions? We can also shift into just open mic, where you can just ask anything, or there may be some specific areas we want to ask you guys about too. So I guess just before we end this portion, I just really want y'all to kind of see what's there, kind of chew on it a little bit, what you have in the handouts, and really think about what is it about this that we could use? Not how do we use all of it, but more what about this is conducive to what we use? What information do we already collect? Who's telling us what, who do we have to prove certain things to related to specific requirements? And then how do we use that information to help us to better understand what's happening with the people we serve? Are there mechanisms where we could pull together as a team to then bring all that information together? Can we document it, once a year? How could we use something like the PIT in treatment planning, those kinds of things? So just think about it. And again, thinking about the overlap with Fidelity is that we also recognize, the Fidelity tool doesn't say use Washington State's comprehensive assessment guide to be able, it doesn't say that. We recognize teams can actually meet those Fidelity criteria by way of what they already have in place. But this is, again, these are sets of tools to hopefully help set the stage for success. So thank you, William. So in Alaska, William is saying one of the struggles that our team has is spending so much time addressing basic needs that it gets hard for staff to stay within their roles. 100%. Yep. Yeah, I think that's like the number one challenge here for sure. So I think starting off with just wearing that hat, of what your role is through the assessment, that it's not just like I have to complete the paperwork, but that there's a lot of information that I'm going to be able to gather by way of my role that will help me do better in my role, may be a place to start. And again, just kind of remembering that these templates aren't necessarily meant to be like, I'm going to ask all these questions about the myriad of voices or whatever. Yes, and especially because teams are short-staffed. So just so y'all know, we are well aware it is hard. And it was whatever was hard before COVID is even harder now. So what we're trying, again, to do is to just try to add some of these things back in where maybe they haven't been done. And again, consider these as tools. All right. Well, maybe we'll shift gears. I can follow up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to just dovetail on that. As we're short-staffed and as we're focused on meeting basic needs, I think some of the things, especially for team leadership, to keep paying attention to is how is our time being spent? And if your time is being spent with too many attempts, driving in ways that's using too much time, because the more indirect time you use, the less time to do the direct time work. So it's always revisiting kind of like that balance of where is our indirect time going right now. But I always feel like try to still preserve. I was even thinking this with trying out the comprehensive assessment is you don't have to fully commit to it, but maybe try it with 2 people and just see if it yields the type of information that you actually see the benefit of it. But I think also with every specialist, if we could just even say, identify 1 or 2 people that we're not going to allow drift. We're going to really keep a focus on doing some employment, some psych rehab, some, because I feel like we develop habits as a team that we lose sight of all the things that we are designed to do, even if you're not able to do it at the penetration rate you want. It's just fulfilling for the staff to feel like I can still do a piece of my time doing the specialty role, and keeps you kind of practiced too.
Yeah, I think you could say that about a lot of things within ACT, like the client schedules. Like, I think that's a hard one that a lot of teams, I know we've seen in our newer fidelity reviews this year since COVID, like some of those kind of went to the wayside. And so even just one client at a time, like, okay, here's the treatment plan. Like, let's start to kind of populate the schedule based on what we're going to deliver as dictated by this treatment plan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's another question in here, Lorna, maybe you and I can both speak to that relates to, for those of you who aren't familiar with the TMAC fidelity tool, there is not a specific role for the generalists. So case managers or the licensed mental health professionals on the team, we assess some of that in other ways, but it's not necessarily a specific role on the team. And so the question is, in this particular state, when they're trying to kind of meet the criteria for a team act, and I think this could apply anywhere really, they lose out on having people that are generalists on their team. And so can we speak to the importance of those roles of generalists on a team? People who are, the case managers and the master's level clinicians. So I don't know, do you want to start with that one yourself, and then I can?
Yeah, I could try. And I also was seeing Tammy's comment about appreciating cross training to survive when your team is small and short staffed. So I think of it in this way. There are so many foundational aspects of doing ACT that you need to have people who are good social workers, good clinicians, good therapists, good at psych rehab and tenancy supports. And those contributions show up by way of fidelity review in so many ways. But it's also about having people who are good at keeping up with family and natural supports and making connections and being resourceful in the community. And so, and what I was seeing with Tammy's comment too, is that even though you may have somebody in the role of a co-occurring disorder specialist or the role of an employment specialist, they need support. So everybody, I think the element, the idea of the team approach and cross training and trying to optimize client choice in a service where you get locked in to be served by this team, that if I want help getting a job, but I really don't like Katie, my employment specialist, because she's a white female and I don't really connect well with white females, I need hopefully a non-white female on the team who can get the support from Katie to know how to do those aspects of employment support. So our generalists are patching in to support a range of activities. But I think it's back to, ACT is more than a case management model, and we need actually really good social workers and case managers on an ACT team too, and therapists. So that would be my thought.
Yeah. Yeah, the other question is just how many licensed mental health professionals would you recommend on a team? And
You have a table for that, don't you?
we
Somewhere.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull it up and find it. But, I think in the larger teams, which we, somewhere around the 100 clients, serving about 100 clients, um, the number of master's level clinicians on the team, and not necessarily all licensed, but I would say master's level, knowing that at least, having a team lead who is licensed is really important, is up to 4 of those people. So 4 master's level clinicians on a 100 client team. That's in this table that's kind of guided by the national ACT standards. Um, but some of those people could be in other roles. So they could be the co-occurring
Right.
disorder specialist, or they could be, um, you know, uh, they could be uh, employment specialist. I mean, they could be in lots of different roles. And for like a 50 client team, there would be 2 master's level clinicians on the team, and there could be more. But the tricky thing is that, and this I can see where this question is coming from too, is that we don't in the Team Act specify that the co-occurring disorder specialist or the employment specialist has to have a master's degree. And so sometimes you may lose out on having that number of master's level clinicians on your team by way of not filling that role with a master's level person. So I get that. And I'll look for that table right now here.
Yeah, and small teams that are attempting to follow, say, what we look at for Team Act, that by way of having these specialists in place, and that you're not going to have as many staff because you're not serving as many people, you pretty much crowd out the spaces for having too many generalists. And so that is where, you're doing your best to, again, the employment specialists, we want them being utilized within their role, but they're still going to be probably patching in to do some things around pitching in just with generalist activities. Same with your co-occurring disorder specialist. So, and sometimes in states that are following the DACS does have more explicit language around if you're a large team serving 100 people, you're to have 2 full-time employment specialists, 2 full-time co-occurring disorder specialists. We departed from that in terms of being explicit in the Team Act, where we want 1 person in each position taking a lead expertise role there. But we need everybody else knowing the basics of those practices and pitching in as well. We don't hold them to being 4 positions on a large team per se.
So there's a comment in here, Amy, saying, I've heard that a team of 6 or 7 is just too small. I think a team of 10 to 12 is best for covering coverage and maintaining all the different shifts of 24/7. I mean, I think that is one of the challenges. And I would say not only the challenge of coverage, but also in the smaller teams, it's harder to also maintain specialization because you have fewer people to pull from, and you wind up having people that serve dual roles because of that. So you might have a co-occurring disorder specialist that's also their master's level clinician. And so they're doing CBTP and co-occurring disorder treatment, which I would say is most conducive to that, but sometimes they're splitting it in a lot of other ways too, like a half-time, case manager or employment specialist. And then, to the earlier point about what's the role of a peer, you start getting into doing something that maybe isn't as peer oriented in that role, which is really challenging. Lots of great comments, you guys. Thank you for sharing all of this. we're just kind of working our way through these. Really helpful.
Yeah, so the 6 to 7, Amy's saying find that to be too small. With the national study, it's pretty clean. Third small, third medium, third large for the teams. Like the breakout is pretty clean, and as you can expect,
A
you see
third each.
a third each in terms of the size of the teams, and not surprisingly, smaller, medium-sized teams are operating in catchment areas that are much less densely populated. So more rural areas, you're going to see the smaller teams. I'm checking this out too, Tammy's. If you want to look at Doug's.
Yeah, we also have some questions in the Q&A too. So you guys, this is great. I love hearing from all of you and being able to kind of at least interact, but feel free to again raise your hand. So Kelly in the Q&A asked regarding meeting client basic needs, those urgent needs often overshadow therapeutic and other goals and can interfere with development of or relationships with natural supports. How would you recommend balancing program goals with client needs when there are limited or no resources in some areas that can address basic needs like food and shelter while preventing staff overwhelm and client disengagement? Whew, yeah. So I'm just rereading it just to kind of make sure. How would you recommend balancing program goals with client needs when there are limited or no resources? Yeah. So I think that's a challenge there. I mean, what you're speaking to is also just a very understudied and developed area, which overlaps with rural act and just being in areas where there are fewer resources or fewer people to be able to either recruit for more staff on a team. And there may be fewer resources that they would have in a more urban area, but not necessarily in that kind of more rural area. And so that's a really good question. I'm trying to think of how to answer it. Do you have thoughts?
No, I mean, I think that
It's hard.
I appreciate when I meet teams that have a really strong clinical sophistication as part of the team, because we're working with some folks who can have very complicated symptoms and experiences and background and trauma. And we're not doing due diligence to serve them well when we're not making that a focus through therapy and counseling. But I also feel like our mental health workforce has really been stretched, and we sometimes, by way of how your teams are being paid and reimbursed, that we don't have the funds to competitively hire. In the national survey, the master's level clinician was cited as the most challenging position to hire and retain right now, which really surprised us because we thought it was going to be nurses. But they actually were cited more, endorsed more often. If I think of the models in Europe that do something like ACT, not always quite like how we see it here in the United States, they can have psychologists on their teams. So, PhD level psychologists. So you're getting people who can do true clinical assessments, neuropsych assessments. So I wish we could elevate this more, because I think we have a lot of strengths within our ACT teams, but some of our teams really are stretched when it comes to the clinical part. And that's why we put so much on the psychiatrists and psychiatric care providers, that they and the team leader typically are the two who are bringing the most clinical training and experience to the work.
Jennifer, you had your hand up. If it was a mistake, let us know. You have to unmute yourself though. Oh, maybe it was an error. I think so. Okay, let me get you back out of here. Hold on.
Did you, okay, case management, what type of? So which one do you want to do? Or we're waiting on Jennifer? I was going to speak to Nicole's comment real quick. Okay. Nicole was asking.
Sorry, I'm trying to get Jennifer off. Hold on.
What type of?
I got it.
What type of case management work can a peer do that wouldn't be out of scope for the peer support? So again, I think there's a lot of nuance here, as we were talking earlier, that peers get pulled into almost doing too much of what we call case management, to the point where they're not given space to do peer work, where they are really kind of connecting with people, speaking about advocacy, really trying to have some mutual exchanges with connection, and and use some of the WMR tools that are out there as well. With that said, as part of a team, some of that work of mutuality and connection can happen when I'm assisting you to the grocery store. So I think it's about doing things with thoughtful intention. So that, and it's the same with the employment specialist, that, hey, if I'm asking you to do something that fits with case management, like running and taking somebody to the bank, well, the bank is a place where money is being dealt with, and what better place to be able to strike up a conversation about how satisfied are you right now with how much money you have coming in? Tell me more about your work experience. What was that like? What are things you enjoy? Like, you're intentionally using those spaces of case management to do other things. So you're bundling interventions, so to speak.
Now, since I was messing with the technology, that was on the Q&A, right, Lorna?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. We also have a question that the Q&A box about if you aren't able to really do much around the comprehensive assessment or PIT because of some immediate needs with the client, are there other measures? And I think this is just also a general question, like, are there other measures people are using, clinical tools, outcome measures that are helpful to them to be able to get more of an understanding of the person? And so 2 examples she gave was the brief psychiatric rating scale, or the BPRS, and the other was a role functioning one. I'll have to find it here. But at any rate, if people have examples of measures that they like to use, feel free to put those into the webinar chat. And Amanda, I can also share some that are also being used in other places or within ACT teams. The National ACT study, not the National ACT study, the National EBP project had some outcome measures that were part of that project. You may recall it was a SAMHSA funded study, Lorna, but yeah, we may be able to share. So stay tuned. I think that's a good one to just put into the national listserv, the National ACT listserv. Let's see, where are the other questions that we want to make sure to address in our remaining couple of minutes here, Lorna?
I think we're good. I think there's
just lots of responses.
Okay.
Okay, good. I love that.
Right.
I love that. Chitter chatter. Okay. Any other thoughts, you guys, in our remaining minute before we close out today? Any other thoughts? It was a great call to have so many people commenting, and I think, again, we really want to leverage the expertise of this group. You're all experts in this work, and to be able to kind of learn from each other. I think that's the whole point here. So we really appreciate all the awesome work, yes, that you guys are doing in this work. Yeah.
Yes, and great job, Maria. Lots of useful information. And given that you know the topic for February, you all have great examples of ways in which you've used different engagement strategies to help somebody connect to the team a little bit more, receive services a little bit better for them. And we would love to hear, because you all hearing your own examples, because we get to, we crib and cheat off you all, because when I visit teams, I just have a catalog of like, this team in Maryland used this strategy, this team in Minnesota used this strategy. So you all getting ready to share those. And also keep in mind, we love the ones that work because you use some motivational, collaborative, person-centered, but we serve folks that sometimes that doesn't work, and the risk to them or others is present. It's not going away. And so be prepared to share the ones that they don't feel great to use sometimes, but you do it in the moment because you are truly concerned about them. And I think we
That's
have to
right.
create space to have those conversations for an app team.
Yeah. Yeah, well said.
Because
Exactly.
involuntarily committing people to the hospital is not the only go-to strategy when people are exhibiting risk.
Yeah, 100%. So I think we will hopefully see all of you, if not some of you, but maybe more will be joining us in February. So February 5th. And again, our didactic will be on assertive engagement. And again, please reach out if you've got some specific area strategies, I should say. At least bring them to the call, or at least
Bring
you
to the
could
call.
reach out
Yep.
to us. Yeah, and let us know what you're using. And, it's at the crux of acting. Yeah, it's probably one of the hardest things that you all do, right?
Mhm.
So, and then never mind just the tracking of it. So have a wonderful holiday season for all of you. I hope you can stay warm and safe and energized for the year to come. And we really appreciate this community and all the important work that you do. So thank you so much. We'll see you in February. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.